Before I get into it, just like to acknowledge my co-authors, people I've been working with on this project, namely Nicholas Waldman, who's in Israel at the University of Haifa, where I actually carried out a lot of the analyses. And then Isla and Julie at University of Massachusetts, and Matthew Wooler at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Now, as you may know, at the end of the Pleistocene, there were a lot of extinctions going on, especially with the megafauna in North America. And we'll be talking about woolly mammoths, Mammothus primigenius, who were one of these megafauna that went extinct. This is a recently revealed painting that's life-size on display at University of Alaska in Fairbanks. I think it's very impressive if you're there in person. I want to include it here. These animals had an immense range from Siberia through Alaska and much of North America, and fringing the Laurentide ice sheet. Now, at the end of the Pleistocene, they went extinct. But to quote Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park, life found a way for these animals, at least for a while. And we're going to talk about what happened with one small population of woolly mammoths. So in the talk, I would like to first start out by talking about some background about megafauna and the extinctions, especially in Beringia. Beringia meaning this area here, from easternmost Siberia to westernmost North America. And then we'll get into the specific reconstructions of paleoclimate and paleoecology we've been working on from the St. Paul Island site. So, Beringia, the Bering land bridge at the last glacial maximum. This is a map representing the geography from about 18,000 years ago. This map was just released in 2019. Jeff Bond with the Canadian Geological Survey made this map, and he did his best to combine the current topography and geography with a reconstruction of the shorelines during the LGM when sea level was 150 meters lower. And so you can see the extent of land represented by this green shaded area here. And this is the Bering land bridge connecting the two. I think this reconstruction is very cool because using the bathymetry of the ocean, today he was able to identify paleo lakes, rather large paleo lakes existing on this land bridge, and entire river drainage networks that today are all submarine, but he was able to map these out. It's very cool. Climatically, what was going on during the LGM? Well, first of all, it was a pretty arid place. Things were much drier then. The main reason for this was that there was so much ice covering the Arctic Ocean and the North Pacific Ocean that there just wasn't much of a moisture source to produce much precipitation. So the area was arid, and that kept glaciers from expanding over most of Alaska and the Bering land bridge. There just wasn't enough moisture. We see evidence for dry conditions. There were sand dunes being activated across northern Alaska. Lake levels were drier throughout the center part of Alaska. And there just aren't evidence for glaciers over much of this area. The temperature, on the other hand, is a little bit less constrained. Most of the planet was quite a bit cooler at the LGM. There's actually several lines of evidence that say Alaska was warmer than today during the last glacial maximum. This might come as a surprise. The reasons are that maybe it was drier, allowing the soils to warm up more, or massive Laurentide ice sheet, the presence of this huge topographic feature, was forcing warm air from the Pacific up into Alaska, keeping the temperatures pretty mild. Ecologically, we don't have a lot of information from the land bridge itself because it is now underwater. But we think there was a combination of tundra biomes and these steppe grassland biomes, which may not have a good representation anywhere on Earth today. There's this productivity paradox where we're not sure if the ecosystem was highly productive or not. For a long time, Paul Kohlenbau, a paleoecologist, said that it was too cold and too dry to promote much plant growth. And he said that based on the pollen records from lakes around Alaska. But on the other hand, we know that there were huge herds of megafauna. And to support those animals, there must have been a very productive grassland ecosystem. So the paradigm now has shifted somewhat to this picture of a highly productive area rather than this unproductive, desolate place. The third thing that was going on during the LGM in Alaska was the migration of people from Asia into North America. And Alaska was an important route for that migration to take place. Timing-wise, when this actually occurred, most of the archaeological sites in Alaska and then further down south of the ice sheet and the rest of North America, archaeological sites tend to date to about 13 or 14,000 years ago, indicating that's when people might have first arrived. Based on the genetic evidence of people, we think that there was probably a Beringian standstill where there were people living in the area of the Bering land bridge for thousands of years, waiting until about 14,000 years ago for the ice sheet to start to disintegrate. And that's when they suddenly pushed to inhabit the rest of the continent. And the last do that? People online can hear me okay, right? No, okay, good. So Alaska horses went extinct around 12.8 or 13,000 years ago. The bison were gone by similar time, around 12.8 thousand years ago. Mammoths around 13.8 thousand years ago. These are the youngest mammoth bones found from Alaska, 13.8 thousand years ago. That's when mammoths went extinct here. And the oldest moose bones, so when moose first arrived into Alaska, occurred about the same time, around 14,000 years ago. So while some of these species were on their way out, the moose was on its way in. Now, as I mentioned before, there were humans also settling in the area. The oldest archaeological charcoal, so a sign of human presence, dates to about 13,500 years ago, just about the same time or slightly later than the extinction of mammoths. But as I mentioned, there were probably people living on the land bridge and in that area for thousands of years prior to this, and we just haven't found much evidence for that. It's a big area of study. I'll leave it at that. So the extinction of these animals. At the end of the Ice Age, about 70% of these North American megafauna went extinct. Some example species are ground sloths, the short-faced bears, lions, saber-toothed lions, saber-toothed tigers, dire wolves, beavers, giant beavers, excuse me, and of course the woolly mammoths. And the cause of these extinctions, I think, continues to be debated. It's usually prescribed to some combination of climatic and ecological changes and human hunting pressures. And because of those human hunting pressures, it's often kind of couched as this moral story. Humans arrive, animals disappear. There's this quote here: the demise of the megafauna is often packaged as an environmental morality tale. But probably there's some aspect of climate and ecology that would have hit these animals even if people hadn't shown up. The effects of their extinction were pretty widespread. So with specific regards to the proboscideans, meaning the mammoths, elephants are also proboscideans, the presence of the mammoths probably favored herbaceous types of plants rather than woody plants. The presence probably suppressed fire frequency, accelerated nutrient cycling, helping us explain the productivity paradox. And then they would have been disturbing soils, which we think might have contributed to the soils being more dry. So that's kind of what was going on. And now to think more about this, well, I'll share this. If you've ever wondered if there were mammoths found in Minnesota, indeed there have been. This is a map showing the occurrence of fossil mammoth bones across Minnesota, lots of different sites. Both mammoths and mastodons have been found in Minnesota. It's very cool. And if you've been to the Bell, has everybody here been to the Bell Museum? Raise your hand if you've been to the Bell Museum. If you haven't, you should go check it out. They have a life-size recreation of a woolly mammoth, which I just went to see for the first time this morning, and it's very cool. I will admit, though, well, you can't even see in this picture, right behind the woolly mammoth, there's a giant beaver, which I found even more fascinating. I could not stop looking at this enormous beaver. It is really bizarre and neat. So go take a look if you haven't been there. Zooming out, woolly mammoths, like I mentioned, have a pretty broad range, and they have been found all over North America. This is based on reports in the paleobiology database. And we will today be focusing on this population up in Alaska. Actually, we'll be focusing on this population outside my little box. But inside this box, in Alaska, the oldest bones date to about 13.8 thousand years ago. So this is a histogram showing the ages, radiocarbon ages of mammoth bones. The youngest one being 13.8. If we consider this site and a couple other sites outside of that box, mainly Wrangell Island and St. Paul Island, we find younger bones. So compared to mainland Alaska, where they went extinct 13.8 thousand years ago, on Wrangell, we find bones as young as 4,000 years old. And on St. Paul Island, as young as 5,500 years old. So these are the two locations. And this is, on geologic time, this is relatively recent. There were pretty big human civilizations by then growing in other parts of the world. So what makes these sites special? Well, here's our map of Beringia during the LGM. The coastline much expanded because of lower sea level compared to today. Wrangell Island was a hill. I'll show it with my mouse so people online can see. It was a hill during the LGM, and today, of course, it's an island. St. Paul Island is down here, and of course, it was another hill during the LGM. And St. Paul Island, the population here is where we're going to look at, because these two sites are where life found a way. I think it's just really remarkable. Imagine sea levels slowly rising, and somehow this small group of mammoths decided to climb up this hill and just stay there while sea level rose over the next hundreds or thousands of years. It's a pretty remarkable thing that this could have happened. There are several other islands that were hills where we don't find mammoth bones. So St. Paul and Wrangell are really special. So St. Paul Island, this is the study site for this project. Here's a map of it just from Google Maps. It's about 450 kilometers from the mainland of Alaska. It's pretty small, 110 kilometers squared or 42 miles squared, with a maximum elevation of 200 meters. For comparison, it's just slightly, well, it's a lot farther, a lot closer to Alaska than St. Paul, Minnesota. Minnesota here is 5,000 kilometers from Alaska. Who cares? But to give you some size scale, it's just a little bit smaller than the city of St. Paul. Ecologically, today, there's no permafrost on this island, even though it's a pretty high latitude. And the plant communities are kind of described as this moss herbaceous tundra. We will be looking at a sediment core from Lake Hill, right in the center of the island. It's a maar lake formed from volcanic activity. Today, its depth is only 2 meters, but it's thought to be the only lake on this island that has a sediment record that extends through the entire Holocene. So that's why it's a useful lake to look at this mammoth extinction. In 2014, a group from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, including Matt Wooler, went to this lake and cored it, and that's what we'll be looking at. So the questions we're going to look at with this sediment core are, what might have caused the eventual extinction of woolly mammoths here, and what were the consequences ecologically of that extinction? Any questions so far? Okay. So a quick picture of what it looks like to core a lake in the Arctic. Got a few slides showing some coring projects that we did in northeastern Alaska and at Tulips. These are actually near Tulips Lake, where you've been. So this is our group in May on the lake ice taking sediment cores. So May is a really good time to take sediment cores in Alaska. The lakes are still frozen, but you have really long days. And so it's really fun. And you can see a herd of caribou in the background. So to take a sediment core, we go out there with an ice auger, drill a hole in the lake. Then we emplace this core casing. These are just 4-inch PVC pipes. We make a string of them and push it into the mud, just a few inches. And then we push our Livingston core through that PVC pipe. And this way we can go up and down the same exact hole many times and get 1 meter sections deeper and deeper. Okay, so this is how we get multiple meters long, one at a time. A 1 meter section. We push the sediments out of the core barrel tube and ship them back in little cases like this. Take some more pictures. Here's a photo for our album cover. Very cool. And there's a lot of hauling gear around. So you can do this in the summer as well. We've done that, but going in the wintertime is really nice because you have a nice solid platform to do all this coring. Now, the Lake Hill core, the crew from Alaska recovered about 14 meters of sediment in this way. The core is actually stored right down the street at the LACOR facility in Minneapolis. And so I visited the facility in 2020 and sampled this core for geochemical analyses. On the right is a picture of the core. It's kind of washed out on the screen. But the core, again, is about 14 meters long, and it extends about 18,000 years into the past. This age model is based on radiocarbon dates. And the first set of analyses that Alaska group did was try to figure out when the mammoths went extinct. That was kind of the first question that they had to ask. And they came up with 4 independent lines that all placed the extinction at 5.5 thousand years ago. The first line of evidence, which I've already mentioned, is the radiocarbon ages of the bones. So this was not from the sediment core, but from bones found on the island. The youngest one is here. And these other 3 are from the sediment core. So the first one is magnetic susceptibility. This is a record of the magnetics in the sediment core, and it's basically thought to represent grain size in this case. And what they postulated was that the presence of mammoths around the lake disturbed a lot of the soils and washed in larger particle-sized material into the lake. As soon as they went extinct, the whole setting became more stabilized, and you had smaller particles accumulating in the lake, decreasing the magnetic susceptibility. This green one is a proxy called sporomyella. These are spores that only grow on the dung of large mammals. And so the presence here indicates that there must be mammoth dung, and their absence afterwards tells us that there was no more mammoth dung. And the third one that came from the sediment core is the sedimentary DNA. And they looked for DNA markers of proboscideans, and they found it up until sediments about 5,500 years ago. So we've got a good concrete age of when the mammoths finally disappeared, but we don't know why. The main hypotheses, there have been several. Some are climatic, and some are otherwise. For example, drought is the leading hypothesis right now. We think that freshwater resources became too limited and they suffered from dehydration. Alternatively, water contamination could have been a problem. In fact, in Africa 2 years ago, a cyanobacteria bloom in a pond killed a herd of 40 elephants. If that kind of thing happened on this lake, it could be a plausible trigger. Human hunting, another possibility. I think one of the things that sets this site apart from the mainland of Alaska is that there weren't humans occupying the island, as far as we know, until some Russian sailors in the 1700s. So there's no evidence for people at the island, and we don't think this is a likely cause. Winter rainfalls can be extremely hard for megafauna living in Alaska today. Muskox are especially stressed out when their coats become saturated with water during winter. So that's one plausible scenario. Genetic inbreeding, probably an important factor. We know that these mammoths exhibited island dwarfism. Their body sizes were getting smaller over the 5,000 or 6,000 years they lived there. And so we know there was some element of genetic inbreeding. Food shortage could be a cause. Heat wave could have done them in. Wildfires. It might have been some combination of these, right? And so what I wanted to do was revisit the sediment core and try to look for organic geochemical markers that would give us some hints. So organic geochemical proxies. These are pretty, in some ways, they're a novel way of reconstructing climate and ecosystems. In some way, they're pretty well established. They've been around for 20 years in a big way. So these are compounds, organic compounds found in lake sediments, which are produced by either bacteria or archaea or plants and animals. What I've done with those sediment samples is extracted the organic compounds and analyzed them using either gas chromatography or HPLC, liquid chromatography. And I'm going to be showing some results based on both the isotopes and the concentration of various compounds. So we'll dive into some specific organic biomarkers and what we find in the Lake Hill sediment core. The first class of compounds I'll show are the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. And these are compounds formed by a couple different mechanisms, either petrogenesis or by combustion. So oftentimes in paleoecology, we think about them as a past wildfire proxy. What we find at the Lake Hill site is a big change in the concentration of PAHs. So here are the data from Lake Hill. Here's age on the x-axis from 18,000 years ago up to present day on the right. And here's the concentration of PAHs, micrograms per gram of sediment. And this dashed line here represents the time of mammoth extinction. So based on this graph, we might infer that the extinction of mammoths were associated with a rise in wildfires. I would have a caution on that, though. This green data is the same proxy, PAHs, but now normalized to the amount of organic matter in the sediment. So instead of normalizing it to the amount of sediment, we're normalizing it to the concentration of organic matter or total lipids. And when we do that, we get a very different picture. We see the highest values back here during the late glacial period and pretty low values and no change following the mammoth extinction. So the way I interpret this is that the late glacial period saw more fires. And this is probably related to the more arid conditions of the glacial period. And this is consistent with what we see in charcoal records from other lakes around Alaska. During this intermediate period of the early Holocene, the island had become isolated. Mammoths were present and there was very little fire activity. And then during this last period, I'm not exactly sure what to make of this. It could be a rise in fire activity following the mammoths, but I'm more inclined to think that this is an artifact of the change in sedimentation related to the mammoths going extinct. Remember that magnetic susceptibility said the sedimentation changed, and I think this is reflecting that. In either case, I would just stress that the way you normalize this data really makes a big difference. And I don't think people who are doing paleo wildfire work always think about that, and they should be reconsidering how they do this. All right, the second proxy in organic geochemistry are the plant waxes. So here's a picture of leaf waxes on I don't remember what kind of tropical plant this is, but you can see they've etched in the word leaf waxes into the leaf waxes, very meta. But all plants make leaf waxes. These are the cuticle on the surface of leaves that help protect leaves from water loss or from predation, etc. And these are made up of pretty simple compounds, such as the N-alkanes, shown here. This is a simple organic alkane. And the distribution of alkanes relates to what types of plants are contributing the alkanes to the sediments. So this alkane that I've drawn here has 18 carbons, but sometimes you get them shorter, sometimes you get them longer. When we look at the alkanes in the sediments from Lake Hill, we see a pretty broad distribution of chain lengths or carbon number present. In general, we tend to interpret the shorter chain lengths, 16 and 18, as being indicators of algae. These are made by algae. The really long alkanes with high carbon number are made by shrubs, trees, and grasses. And these intermediate ones are thought to generally reflect inputs from mosses or other aquatic macrophytes. We see big changes at Lake Hill. To illustrate that, here's one sample from 11.6 thousand years ago, and another before the mammoths went extinct, and another sample after the mammoths went extinct. And we see an obvious change away from the long chain lengths and a much higher prevalence of the C23, which we think is usually made by mosses. We can summarize these this distribution into a single number. I've done it two ways. One, I've taken the weighted average chain length, or ACL, of this distribution and plotted it over time. I've also plotted the ratio of C23, a short chain length, to C29 over time. And that's shown in purple and orange. And what we see here is this big, obvious change corresponding with the extinction of mammoths. This change, it's the resolution of our sediment core and age model make it hard to know which came exactly first, but I think that the change in the carbon number of the alkanes occurred after the mammoths went extinct. So the mammoth extinction led to some plant community change. And specifically, the big spike in C23 causing the lowering of these ratios probably tells us that the aquatic plant community was able to really become established and contribute a lot more waxes after the mammoths were gone. So I'm envisioning this turbid pond while the mammoths were there. And after they were gone, the water the sediments settled out, you had clearer water and more macrophyte growth. The third ecological proxy based on organic biomarkers has to do with GDGTs. Has anybody heard of a GDGT before? On your professor. GDGTs are a really important paleoclimate proxy. And this class of GDGTs called isoprenoid GDGTs, which I've shown 2 examples of here, are made by archaea. So single-celled organisms living in the lake, maybe in the soils as well. And it turns out in oceans, the degree of cyclization, this one has 0 cyclic groups, and this one has 5 cyclic groups in the molecular structure. How many cyclic groups there are correlates really strongly with water temperature. And so this is maybe the most important sea surface temperature paleoclimate proxy that we have. In lakes, it doesn't work like that. Instead, we think that we can use the ratio of these 2 in particular to reconstruct lake anoxia. Lake anoxia, obviously a very important topic. If you have algae blooms and lakes going anoxic, this might be a good way to investigate that through time. The way it works is that the GDGT0 compound is made by methanogens. They need anoxic productive waters. So they would reflect in a scuzzy pond. The Crenarchaea are made by ammonia oxidizing archaea, and so they would have a different set of conditions they prefer. And what we see at Lake Hill is shown in this upper green one, the ratio of GDGT0 to Cren. And we also see a big change in this ratio around the time of the mammoth extinction. Higher values of that ratio indicate more anoxic waters. So that one hypothesis about water quality might have been an important factor here. This would indicate that the water was becoming more eutrophic in the centuries leading up to the mammoth extinction. So to summarize these ecological changes, water quality or anoxia might have been a driver of mammoth extinction. The plant community, especially the aquatic macrophytes, responded strongly following the extinction event. And wildfires, it's not clear if they played a part in the extinction or not. I think not. Now, I'd like to share, those are the kind of paleoecological indicators we have from the organic geochemistry. And I will share some of the results about the paleoclimate now. And I've broken this up into 2 proxies, one which is an indicator of summer temperature and one an indicator of winter conditions. So coming back to GDGTs, I guess I should mention what that stands for. A GDGT is a glycerol dialkyl glycerol tetraether. You got it? Good. This branched suite of GDGTs is different than the isoprenoid ones. And this group are made by bacteria rather than archaea. And in general, when we look at, there's a whole bunch more than just these 3, but these 3 are a good example of the methylation number. And you can see in this first one, 1A, there are 4 methyl branches. In 2A, there's 5 methyl branches. We've got those original 4 plus 1 more. And in 3A, we've got that's hexamethylated. And it turns out the number of those methyl branches correlates with temperature. We summarize that ratio, that degree of methylation, with the MBT index. This is the methylation of branched tetraether index. And when we look at global lake sediments, we have this calibration that came out a couple of years ago that shows this strong correlation between air temperature and the MBT index. In particular, we note that the correlation is strongest when we only use the temperature of months above freezing, meaning summer. And this is because this is when the bacteria are most productive. And so we're going to use the MBT index to infer summertime temperatures at Lake Hill. And here is the reconstruction using this method. The axis, again, is from 18,000 years ago to present day. The dark shading represents the uncertainty windows on that calibration, and the red line represents the most likely value. And I've also plotted our data for months above freezing with the Greenland oxygen isotope record, kind of as a comparison, because this is our canonical view of Arctic or high latitude climate change over this time period. A few major points to take away. First one is that if we compare our reconstruction to the actual air temperature, we're slightly overestimating the values. So this calibration might have some issues. But despite this about 4-degree offset between the reconstructed and actual, we think that the trends through time are probably relatively robust. Second thing to notice is that during this deglacial period, the climate was pretty dynamic. The post-glacial warming began around 15,000 years ago, and we find peak temperatures occurring during the Bowling-Allerod warm period. The Bowling-Allerod warmth has been noted from the North Atlantic area around Greenland, and here we're seeing evidence for it as well in the North Pacific. The third and perhaps most interesting point here is that throughout the rest of the Holocene, the climate was warming. So we have increasing temperatures through the Holocene. And if you contrast that with Greenland, we see cooling temperatures over the Holocene here. And I'll come back to this because this was really surprising result. In most places in the Arctic, temperatures have been cooling over the Holocene. And so to see a site that's warming, it was very surprising. And I'll come back and touch on that in a second. In any case, when we put the timing of the mammoth extinction on there, we don't see a big abrupt change in temperature. Perhaps this gradual warming had some impact, but there was no stepwise change that coincided with the mammoth extinction. So how about winter conditions? We're going to come back to our leaf wax alkanes, but instead of looking at the distribution of them, we're going to look at their isotopic composition, specifically their hydrogen isotopes, which I'll refer to as the delta 2H. These molecules here have a carbon backbone, right? But on each of these carbons, there's also 2 hydrogen atoms. That hydrogen that's on those leaf waxes in those molecules is ultimately derived from rainfall. So by measuring the hydrogen to deuterium ratio in the leaf waxes through time, we're getting some perspective on the past precipitation isotopes. Now, precipitation isotopes are really important, really useful paleoclimate indicator. This is a map showing modern day precipitation isotopes across the state of Alaska. And we see really strong correlations with the delta 2H values and the geography. Values are highest in the south at low latitudes and warm places. Values are more negative in high latitudes and high elevations, cold places. Now we'll base the interpretation of the paleoclimate record on a nearby site where they've been doing a lot of modeling work to try to understand what is actually besides temperature and latitude and elevation impacting precipitation isotopes. So at St. Matthew Island, just in the north of our site a little bit, they looked at precipitation oxygen isotopes in a climate model compared to how much sea ice was over the Bering Sea. And they find this really strong inverse correlation where the more sea ice there is, the lower the isotope values. The less sea ice, the higher the isotope values. So that's kind of the framework we're going to use to interpret our data. Here's what the Lake Hill record looks like, again plotted with the Greenland isotope record. And we see a couple short-lived excursions like here and here. But leading up to the Mammoth extinction through the early Holocene, there's very little change. I think I have some things I need to plot in. Oh yeah, okay, sorry. So our interpretive framework for the oxygen or the hydrogen isotope ratios of C29 alkane is here. Higher values indicate less winter sea ice or warm conditions. Lower values indicate more winter sea ice or colder winters. So clearly the winter climate has been warming throughout this entire time period, again, with a couple of these short-lived blips. The Bowling Allerod period does not stand out nearly as much as it did in the GGGT summer temperatures, whereas the Younger Dryas, we see a very surprising but short-lived positive isotope excursion. The Mammoth extinction is here. Again, there's no strong lead up, strong abrupt change. This change following the extinction, I think, is more likely related to the switch from grasses or shrubs to aquatic mosses than a change in the actual precipitation isotopes. So climate, abrupt change in climate, probably not a good culprit for why the mammoths went extinct. Oh, I have more things to pop in, sorry. Now, finally, I want to come back to this point about the Holocene warming that I made with the GGGT summer temperatures. These are our summer and winter reconstructions now together from Lake Hill. This is the GGGT and delta 2H value I just showed you, just kind of compressed so it looks a little bit bigger. And again, what we see in both proxies is warming during the summer and during the winter over the Holocene. This is surprising. Usually we think about Arctic temperature change over this time period as being related to the amount of solar insolation coming in, which I've plotted in this next set of graphs. The amount of solar radiation during summertime peaked about 11,000 years ago and has been declining significantly since then. This is the main driver of declining summer temperatures across the Arctic that we see almost everywhere. Winter insolation is a little bit different. It actually has been increasing since about 7,000 years ago, and we expect temperatures, winter temperatures, to be increasing as a result, which is what we see at our site. To give you a picture from continental Alaska, here's a site, Lake E5 in northern Alaska, which is showing cooling during the summer months over the same time period, which is very much what we do expect. So the question is, why are we getting warming here? Is it an artifact? Is there something going on in the Bering Sea? What's the issue? Well, if you look at paleoclimate records from around the Bering Sea over the same time period, I think that our data are in pretty good agreement with other sites. These are paleo temperature reconstructions from other sites in the area. The colors kind of match here. So Sea of Okhotsk here. St. Matthew Island, which has shown warming over the last 5,000 years here. The Umnak Plateau has been pretty stable or slightly warming it for the last 5,000 years anyway. And then the Gulf of Alaska has been, again, pretty stable or slightly increasing. But none of these show a strong cooling trend, which again is what we would have expected. So what I speculate is happening is that the warming winter temperatures are causing the warming summer temperatures. There's this big difference in seasonality with the insolation, right? I'm envisioning a scenario where the increasing wintertime radiation combined with some increase in CO2 gases over the Holocene has caused a retreat of wintertime sea ice. That retreat of sea ice carries over into the summer season, keeping summer temperatures warmer than we would expect based on the declining radiation. So it's a seasonal carryover effect that helps explain the warming of the Holocene in this area. So that's all the data I would like to show today. I would just summarize with a few key points. The mammoth extinction ecologically seems to be related to degraded water quality, as well as a shift in the vegetation, as indicated by organic geochemical proxies. Secondly, we might have some gradual effect of climate change where we hit a tipping point or some threshold for mammoth survivability, but there was no big, strong, abrupt climate change that was the likely cause of their extinction. And then climatologically, these opposing Holocene summer temperature trends with other sites was a real surprise. And I think that the winter sea ice seasonal carryover effect is really important. And with that, I will just wrap up and take questions. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
Is there a reason why, or do people know why there's no evidence of mammoths Sound or no fact with like two and yet there's mammoth evidence?
Where is St. Lawrence Island?
Right after.
No, why they showed up on St. Paul but not St. Lawrence? Or yeah, I think this is a fun mystery. Should I go back? Look at the map. Oh, I'm not sharing on Zoom. Oh, sorry. I'll reshare so we can look at the map. Huh. Didn't mean to do that. No, I don't know why it would be. I think it's a miracle that mammoths ended up on the islands that they did. I think it's harder to explain why they ended up on these islands than why they didn't end up on these other islands. So St. Lawrence must be this big one. I think it's a great question.
Those are way bigger than St. Paul. That's interesting.
Interesting. It's a really interesting question. I don't have an answer for that. If you can speculate why they wouldn't have ended up there, that'd be great.
Islands. So in St. Paul Island, you said there was no permafrost. What about the Wrangell Island, which is Farnose?
Wrangell Island, I think, has permafrost today. It's far enough north.
Do you know whether permafrost was affected by the?
That's another great question. And I don't know, we would have, I don't think anybody's tested that or figured it out. I think it would be a fun question to try to explore because I hinted that the mammoth presence was disturbing the soils and maybe helping dry soils out. And across the whole region, soils were dry during the LGM. So the Bering land bridge might not have had permafrost on it. We don't know that. And then to ask what the mammoth extinction did to the permafrost, it's a great question. Yeah. Okay.
I was like, say, the I was closer to the mainland. So I wonder if they could have just physically left.
They could have swam, or yeah, if there was sea ice.
Whole island is way in the middle of the ocean, right? They would have been stuck. They really would have been stuck.
Yeah, at various times. At various times, you would have had sea ice providing a bridge that they could have just walked across if they had the gumption to go out there and try to get somewhere. Yeah, so sea ice would have been temporary connectors. The site, St. Paul Island, you can see right now it's on the very southern part of the land bridge. It also happens today to be right on the very edge of the winter sea ice extent. So as winter sea ice is receding today and in the future, this site is especially susceptible to big changes in its ice and ecology and climate. Oh yeah, people, this is important hunting area for people, and because the ice is limited now, it's becoming hard to hunt. Just let me show one. I'll get your question in a second. I thought it'd be interesting to see the size of the island is shown here shrinking over time as sea level rises. So I think this yellow, this lightest color yellow, is when it's still connected to everything. And then it became isolated around 14,000 years ago. Yeah.
I'm just going to ask if is there a record or proxy for lake level?
Yes, there is. Are you thinking in terms of lake infilling, in terms of climate drying?
I think it's sort of water.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, drought has been one of the leading hypotheses. And this first group that cored the lake looked at diatom assemblages in the sediments. And they thought that leading up to the extinction, there was a shift to saltier loving diatoms, which could indicate lowering lake levels and a drier condition, which supports the drought hypothesis. I think that if you combine the drought, like lowering lake levels, that would have exacerbated water quality issues as well. And so I think the drought and the water quality issues actually fit nicely together. Like they would have been more stressed for drinking water. Yeah. Yeah.
The water quality was worse in the presence of mammoths to still give us erosion. And can you elaborate on how mammoths could have reached the erosion?
Yeah, the picture that we have is that Lake Hill is one of the few lakes on the island that would have been the drinking water source. There were also some brackish water lagoons around the edge of the island that we think they were probably drinking from, low enough salinity that they could drink from it. But if they were using this lake as an important drinking water resource, they would have been in the lake, and these are big animals, really muddying up the stream beds, probably defecating in the water. So I think that they contributed to their own degradation of water quality. Yeah, nitrogen concentrations, turbidity. I think it would have been a nasty spot at that time. Any graduate students have questions? Oh, good. Oh, yeah.
So it's a paradox. I don't know if it's but there are ideas about how grass grew there. Like you proposed ideas.
Yeah, I think the two things that help kind of resolve this paradox. I think that for a long time, it was one of these debates that people would stand up and shout at each other in meetings, right? The tundra was productive during the LGM. No, it wasn't. And now I think most people are in agreement that it was pretty productive. I think we've learned that the temperatures weren't as extreme as people thought they were. So at the LGM, globally, temperatures were about 4 degrees Celsius colder than today. In the Arctic, they were probably 15 degrees colder than today, at least. So that's pretty extremely cold, and it's hard to picture that being productive. But we think in this area of Beringia, temperatures were actually pretty mild. So that helps explain how you have more productivity. And secondly, we've come to learn that the presence of the megafauna themselves probably help keep the system productive by recycling nitrogen, disturbing the soils, et cetera. Sam.
You know the sizes of populations of the island?
People have done modeling on that, both in terms of like the food and water resources and the size of the island. I don't remember the specifics of what they said. I think it was on the order of a few hundred mammoths living on St. Paul Island. So in about the size of St. Paul, the city, there might have been a few hundred. I think that's right. I should don't quote me on that. Yeah, Tim.
If you found the smoking gun for the disappearance of mammoth on this island, what would be the implications for the disappearance of mammoths in other places?
Yeah, so the fact that it's hard to relate this to the extinction mammoths on the mainland. For one thing, so with the mammoth extinction, we think humans versus natural causes. First of all, if there were humans living in Beringia for thousands of years longer than we thought they were, that would indicate that mammoths and humans were cohabitating for a very long time without something going extinct. And that would kind of absolve humans from some of the responsibility there. But then again, the fact that mammoths did go extinct eventually on the mainland and not on this island would tell us that, well, that would implicate humans, and this little refuge was safe from humans. I think the genetic inbreeding, the small population on a small island, it was going to happen one way or another, whether climate did or not. I think the more interesting implication is what was the implication for other island living species to climate change in the future. These organisms couldn't migrate. If climate did change, they were stuck in place. They couldn't exchange genetics with the Wrangel Island population. So they were just susceptible. There was a very, very sensitive population. And I think that's the case for many populations of island organisms. Are there any chat questions or just, oh.
Final questions for Will? I want to thank Will for coming down here.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.